The Bataan Death March of 1942 was the forcible transfer by the Japanese Imperial Army of 76,000 American and Filipino soldiers who became POWs after a 3-month battle in Bataan. This 80-mile march was characterized by wide-ranging physical abuse and murder and resulted in very high fatalities inflicted upon prisoners and civilians alike by the Japanese Army. 3 survivors of this horrible march are A.B. Abraham, Tommy Thomas, and Dr. Hibbs. All the survivors were forced into the O'Donnell camp until some were moved to the Cabanatuan camp in the Philippines. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Musey and Captain Robert Prince were the masterminds behind the liberation of this camp, along with Filipino guerrilla Pahota. These are their stories.
Thank you for joining us today to document the experiences in the Philippines. Let's start with Colonel Mucci. Can you please recount what started this off?
Well, one day, MacArthur brought me over to his tent to talk about an important matter. He told me about a camp that resided near Cabanatuan, which held 506 prisoners, and he then explained that he wanted me to bring a group of rangers to liberate the camp. So he then dismissed me, and I had to leave to get everything prepared.
So what did you do next?
There was this one young fellow named Prince who was supposedly very intelligent. I called him over and I gave him the details of the mission. Then I went over to the Rangers and told them that we were moving out soon on this secret mission. The men seemed pretty happy, and since we haven't been doing anything. And then we gathered all of our belongings and we brought provisions, and then we set out on this long march through very difficult terrain. Sometimes we would even have to cross bridges that held Japanese troops on them.
I heard that you had some help from the Filipino guerrilla army. Is that true?
Yes, it is. In fact, I don't think that many of us would have survived without them. They provided us with crucial information, and without this information, we would have entered this camp without prior knowledge of the Japanese leaving, so it would have been a massacre.
Well, then it's a good thing that you received help from them. What did you do once you got home?
I came home to Bridgeport, Connecticut as a national hero, and then I ran for Congress, but my campaign was unsuccessful. So right now I'm living in Bangkok as a Far Eastern representative of a Canadian oil company.
That's very good. Next we can welcome Captain Robert Prince, who is in charge of designing the plan for the raid of the Cabanatuan. So, Prince, how were you affected by receiving such a difficult position?
I was honored to receive such an essential position. Being appointed assault commander for such an inspiring mission was both nostalgic and horrendously frightening. Most of all, I just wanted to get the job done so I could get home to my bride, Barbara. That being said, I was also particularly attached to this mission and the men involved in it. All in all, I did my best to keep a cool head and devise a plan that would get my comrades home quickly and safely.
I'm sure your steady nerves helped with the design and execution of such a taxing mission. Speaking of which, how did you finally decide on the plan for the raid?
The intel Musey and I received from the Alamo Scouts was crucial in the planning of the raid. I'm particularly grateful for the reconnaissance Bill Neist and Rufo Vaquiller took part in. The 2 men stayed in a cramped nipa shack all day, directly in sight of Japanese soldiers, in order to draw a floor plan of the Cabanatuan camp. The floor plan was the basis of my plan. Everything else just fell into place, and when we knew the specifics of the prison.
Thank God for your scouts. You and Mucci have been pretty close throughout the mission. What was your relationship with the colonel like?
Well, at first I couldn't really figure out why he had chosen me to be his assault commander. I guess he just saw something in me that no one else did. I've always looked up to him, and I'm still very thankful for the opportunity he granted me.
And what about the other Rangers? What was your relationship with them?
For the most part, the other members of the 6th Battalion respected Colonel Musey's decision to allow me to design the raid. However, I believe there may have been some doubt among the ranks. Sometimes I got the feeling that some of the older members of the C and F Company questioned my abilities on account of my young age and inexperience. I like to think my endeavors gained some respect, though.
I think it's safe to say they have, Captain Prince. What do you do now?
Well, after I returned home, I went on a bond drive tour with some other Rangers to help our men overseas. There I met President Roosevelt in the White House, a truly inspiring visit. Once I retired from the Army in '46, I took up the family business selling apples. Nowadays, I live with my wife Barbara in Kirkland, Washington.
I wish you both well and congratulations on your induction into the Ranger Hall of Fame. So tell me, what was life like in the hospital?
Life in the hospital was absolutely disgusting. Death, disease, and starvation surrounded and engulfed the entire hospital. It was so hard to breathe with the smell of dead, rotting bodies all throughout the air.
The worst part was the medicine, because there was none of it, and it was very hard to cure people when there was no medicine to be found.
How did the illnesses change over time?
Well, many of the illnesses adapted to the few medications that we had, and so they were rendered useless, and ultimately this led to more illness and death throughout the hospital.
What new technique did you create to survive?
Well, we were in desperate need of nourishment, so I perfected the technique of catching little delicious ducks. We would crouch in a ditch beside the pond and drop a fishing line, a baited fishing line with a hook, and waited for the ducks to eat the bait, and we'd snatch them up. And we would call this technique gorking.
What do you do now after the whole experience in the Bataan Death March?
After returning home to Iowa, I then moved to Oregon, where I now run a medical clinic, and I'm currently teaching medicine at the University of Oregon. In the past years, I've written a couple articles in medical journals on diseases such as beriberi, as well as many other diseases I encountered frequently during my time in the Philippines.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
The next guest is A.B. Abraham, who was a soldier imprisoned in the Camanachon camp. So, A.B., tell me about the camp. What did you do while you were serving there?
During my imprisonment at the camp, I made the decision to harness my body in order to protect my family, my friends, and anyone else in my life from the grueling torture I endured. I was a boxer before I entered the camp, but now I would train to become a champion. While my body was a skeleton while in prison, I planned on getting stronger and stronger until the day I could leave. The guards of the baton were relentless, therefore I needed to intimidate my captors so I could not be abused, like the fellow who had his teeth knocked out because they were made of gold.
Simply inspiring. What was your reaction to the chaos on the Oroku Maru when Americans unknowingly sank a Japanese vessel carrying their own comrades?
My initial thoughts of the destruction of the Oroku Maru were optimistic. However, learning the truth reversed my thinking. The passengers on board the ship were packed inside like sardines and were suffering from suffocation, starvation, and lack of sleep. People would be dying next to each other, dropping like flies, and the heat made every last breath even more difficult to inhale. Once the planes came overhead, I was ecstatic that the soldiers would be liberated before any more damage could be done. However, the explosive gunfire and artillery from the planes bore a hole in the vessel, and the soldiers could feel the breeze swoop their fresh air into the lungs. However, as the battle raged on, Americans would be struck down by the gunfire, shrapnel, and that artillery from friendly planes. They did not die with honor on the battlefield. They were helpless, and only those who were lucky survived. I genuinely feel sympathy for those plane fighters. Knowing that they could have killed their friends and comrades, they must live with eternal guilt and disgrace.
What a terrible dilemma. Finally, what was your reaction when you realized Hotby, your friend and comrade, had given up?
Hotby's death outlined what I needed in order to survive in the torture chamber I was living in. Although he was weak, I was hopeful that he could be treated by a doctor and recover. Unfortunately, Hotby did not share my hopefulness. I can only imagine the dark void in which his mind aimlessly wandered, and any hopes he had of returning to his family or being rescued slowly dimmed. His eyes were glassy black, and I could tell that he had given up, and he was dead within minutes. I was frantically crying and beating rocks with my bare hands out of frustration, and I soon began to follow Hotby's footsteps. The mental picture of my loving wife was the light in my darkness that gave me hope and the will to survive. In order to live, I must harness an iron will to never give up, and to combat any dismal hopes I encounter. Hotby's death was tragic, but his departures give me hope and ultimately my life.
I'm sure if anything, he's glad his departure could ward off your own.
Thank you, Amy. Our final guest today will be another ex-POW, Tommy Thomas. Tommy, what did you use as a coping mechanism during your time in Cabanatuan?
While I was in the Cabanatuan, I pictured my dream house that I knew I would build for myself once I returned from the camp and home to America. It was a simple brick house with only a few rooms. At the camp, I would picture my house in my mind, brick by brick, just to kill time.
I mistakenly decided to be first in line to get on the boxcars that took us from San Fernando to the Cabanatuan. When the train pulled up with a few tiny boxcars and I got on first, with almost 99 men filing in behind me, I knew it was a bad idea. The boxcars had no ventilation and were packed far beyond capacity. I had dying and dead men leaning against me for hours and saw other men trying their best to stay alive in the cars. I felt there was a guardian angel looking over me because I do not know how I managed to stay alive in the far corner of that boxcar with so much death around me.